Hi, I'm Chuck Hart with the Elkhart Model Railroad Club. Tonight we're going to talk about yards and yard limits, the definitions and the rules that apply to yards and yard limits, and how they may apply to your model railroad. So what we're going to discuss is, besides yards and yard limits, we can't do that without getting back to definitions and rule books and timetables and those kind of things. So we're going to talk about that as well. And we'll talk about some of the books that are available from swap meets and historical societies and eBay and so forth that'll help you with your modeling. So my little disclaimer here is this is a presentation will not cover yard designs. Right? We're not going to talk about how to build the yard or whatever. We'll talk about what could be in your yard, but I'm not going to design one for you here on this presentation. But we will have an overview of yards, yard limits, what I said before, rule books, regulations, and how they might apply to your model railroad. So when we take a look at the evolution of the rules, and we can go all the way back to the 1850s, when there was no rule books, there weren't very many railroads. So we take a look at what was in pamphlets for each individual railroad and what an individual railroad might have had for a timetable. And I don't have the book in front of me here, but I read a story a couple weeks ago about a railroad in 1858 that had rule number 8 in their timetable that said if they meet another train head on, they are supposed to stop both trains, and the conductors are supposed to get out and decide which train should back up.
Oh, wow.
And the engineers were not supposed to be involved in that discussion because they didn't want a free-for-all of 4 guys, just 2 guys having a discussion. So yeah, that was in a timetable early on, long before they had rule books.
Sounds like our railroad.
In 1887, beg pardon? What'd you say, Bill?
It sounds like our railroad.
Yeah, right. It does sound like our railroad. You're right. So in 1887, rules were starting to come around and being developed because there were more railroads and there were more railroad companies, and so they had to come up with something. So the first book was called the Standard Code of Operating Rules, and a later edition, mine is 1959. They started bringing those out, and then it turned into the Consolidated Code of Operating Rules, and I have a copy of that as well. Wasn't formally adopted until 1949, so it took a long time for something to be formally adopted for all the railroads in the United States. Even though they had rules, they didn't have a central location to bring those rules out of. In the modern era, we've got, of course, the Code of Federal Regulations, which now the government has got more involved with the rules and regulations of all kinds of things. And under that you have the Consolidated Code of Operating Rules, CCOR, and then you have the Northeast, and we're going to cover both of these, the Northeast Operating Rules Advisory Committee. Both of those still exist today. Actually, the Consolidated Code is no longer here. The General Code of Operating Rules exists today, along with the NORAC. And then under those are the Federal Railroad Administration organizations, rules and regulations, and the Association of American Railroads. They both have very specific and distinct differences as how they apply to railroads. Canada and Mexico have their own set, of course. It's a foreign country, so they have their own rule books. They don't have to go by the ones in the United States. So if you're going to be on CN traveling from Canada to the US now, or CP, then you're going to have 2 different rule books to go by. And now CP is joining KCS, so they're going to have 3 different rule books to go by.
Oh yeah.
So, all right. So rule books. There's lots of different ones. The one on the left is called the General Code of Operating Rules. That is the blue one. That's this guy right here. And then the one in the middle is Southern Pacific, and that's books around about the 1950s or 60s. That's this guy. SP had their own rule book,
They
and
make their own rules.
they make their own rules, and a lot of railroads did. They made their own rule books following the FRA and the Code of Federal Regulations. They could still make their own rule books. And you're going to find that even under the general code, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, not all the railroads follow this book. So we'll show you what the difference is. And then on the right side is the Consolidated Code of Operating Rules, which is the red book that I showed you. So employee timetables. The key word here is employee timetable, not the one you use when you want to take the train to someplace on the Amtrak these days, or a previous trip on another passenger carrier. You want to get what's called an employee timetable to help you with your model railroad, and they will say things on them like for the government and information of employees only, or for employees only, or whatever. And I've got a bunch of different ones you can look at, but you'll want an employee timetable if you're going to use it for your model railroad, because that's where the real information is at. So there's some various ones here. I've got more of them. So let's take a look at what's inside here, because this is where will lead us into the discussion of yard limits later on. When you look at an employee timetable, one of the most important pages is this one, and it still shows like the train numbers, times, and mileposts, which we use here on the railroad now. The type of traffic control, in other words, what type of signaling is being used, and I'll point out where that's at on here. The station's yard limits, which is later in the discussion. And then you've got these code letters right down through here on this side. And you won't find that meaning in the timetable. You'll have to go back to one of the code books to find out what those code letters mean. So if there's a P, like some of these stations have a P next to them, that's a telephone. So you know there's going to be a phone at that station. A is automatic block interlocking. It goes on. I is an interlocking. K is a clock. So if there's a station that has a standard clock, it'll tell you where that clock is located on the timetable, which station it's at. Fuel, Y, office, all kinds of other things. If you're modeling the steam air wheel, you'll want to get an older timetable. You'll find things in there for W for water and C for coal. And usually that was about every 100 miles in the steam days. But it would tell you which station had your coal and which station had your water and that type of thing. Also regular stops, flag stops, and so forth are on the time. And there's more of them. I just put this up as an example. We did see yard limits up here. Down here at this part, it does say yard limits. And then the bracket right here is your signaling system, and that can change as you go down from one station to another. As you're going down the main line, you might have automatic blocking system, or you might have warrant control, whatever, and it will be in a bracket on the timetable on the station side. Okay, so AAR books, interchange rules, explosives, trailer, container, flat car, so forth, standards of signals. There's all kinds of books out there that you can get. So, all right, here's some that are good to have for your model railroad, and I'll show you a couple more. The one on the left is the ORER, Official Register of Railway Equipment. The one in the middle is the Official Register of Passenger Train Equipment, and the one on the right is the Official Guide. So going back to the one on the left, this one here will list all the box cars for a particular year, and it came out every quarter. Well, not just box cars, excuse me, all the cars, all the freight cars that all the railroads had. The copy that I have here is this one. I think this is from about 1972 or so, and I've got a more recent copy. I think I got a 2000 in my box here, and it's like 3 times this thick. It's massive for all the freight cars that are available in the system today. So you can use that. If you're going to model a particular railroad, then you can find out what series of boxcars that railroad had for the year that you want to model, and then you can put the correct numbers on it. You can find out what size those cars were. All that information is in here, plus there's information on clearances and so forth. The one in the book in the middle is the official Register of Passenger Train Equipment. That book is no longer available. The one on the left is, but the one on the middle is no longer available, and that listed all the passenger equipment for all the railroads from about 1938 to the point in time when Amtrak took over. All right, so it's not produced anymore. I believe it was about 1938 or so is when that book started to come out. That only came out once a year. The one on the left comes out every quarter. The one on the right is the official guide of the railways. This is a neat book too, because it will tell you not only passenger information that you won't find in the employee timetable, but it will tell you things about connections with shipping companies. It will give you the complement of trains, what kind of cars were in that particular consist, that type of thing in this book here. I think nowadays it's called the Railway Guide or the Guide to Railways or something that they've left out a couple of words. No, I don't believe the word official is in there anymore. Well, let's see if we can hit the right button here. Okay, here's two more books that I feel are kind of essential for model railroaders. The one on the left is called Rights of Trains. This book, and both of these, by the way, are available still today, and you'll see it in the bibliography of how to get those books. Rights of Trains. I think I got one here. Yes, I do. I think my edition's the 5th. I believe it's up to the 8th edition now. This one here has codes in it from many, many years ago up to today. So it's a really neat, it's a lot of fun to read, because if you want to find out what kind of codes you should be using on your model railroad, this has got them all. Right? The book on the right is called Condensed Code of Operating Rules. Sounds kind of official. It is not official at all. This book here, and it's, as far as I know, the 1951 edition is the only one still available. This book is put out for model railroads, and it has a listing of I don't know, about 24 railroads that help put that book together. Help put that book together. So, and that's still available too. I think it's $15. So those two and the previous books are really good to have, and then your employee timetables. So let's find out what a yard is. Trying to get into this discussion a little bit of yards and yard limits. If we want to find out what a yard is, we have to go back to the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 49, Subtitle B, under Regulations Related to Transportation, Chapter 2, FRA Administration, Department of Transportation, and then we go to Parts 200 to 299, and we finally find Part 299.5, yard. Right? This is the only place you're going to find a definition of a yard. Is in the Code of Federal Regulations. And a yard means a system of tracks within defined limits and outside of the territory controlled by signals, which can be used for the making up of trains or the storing of maintenance away. That's a yard. It's a simple little definition, and that's all it means, is a place to make up trains, except the most important part of this definition is outside of the territory controlled by signals. What does that mean? Anybody want to guess?
Dispatcher can't touch it.
The dispatcher has no control in the yard, and it is off the main line. Right? It has nothing to do with the main line. That's a yard. That's probably the most important part of this statement or definition of a yard. It has nothing to do with the main line. So, and we're going to take a look at the yard a little bit more in depth. because we all know, being model railroaders, we've done some research, there's more to a yard than just a place to make up trains and store maintenance away. So let's take a look at that. But off the main line. So flat yard switching. Flat yard, basically the locomotive pushes cars back and forth. A brakeman gets up there and he rides the car to slow it down, so when he slams into the other car, he hopes he's not going to fall off. He's hanging onto that brake wheel up there. Hump yard switching. Hump yard has construction over a hill, and the locomotive lets go of cars with a switchman uncoupling the car, and the cars go down to a area where they go through these retarders, excuse me, thank you, Jeff, retarders to slow the cars down before they go into the classification tracks. Okay, yard components. We know it's not more or not just maintenance away. So we got receiving yards, we've got arrival yards, switching yards, classification yards, departure yards, and in your departure yards, you hope that your guys that, from the class block the train, so it makes it easier to switch cars out the next stations down the line. We got car repair, maintenance yards, engine facilities, transfer yards, unit tracks, coach yards. It goes on and on. There's all kinds of yards, but it all comes from the basic definition of what a yard is. All right, yard tracks. Inside those portions of the yard are all kinds of tracks. And the railroad is going to name everything, you know that. So they're going to have scale tracks, shop tracks, cleaning, storage, passenger service, freight house track. House track is usually a track right behind the station, by the way. Locomotive service, caboose tracks, goes, and there's probably many, many more, but this tells you how a yard might be made up in different types of tracks. Then you go back to the FRA, and it's going to have a listing of all the kind of people that work in a yard. And I didn't go into any other areas because we were talking about yards. So you got an inside hostler. He's usually a fireman. And the inside, there's a difference between an inside and outside hostler. I'm going to try to explain it. The inside hostler is usually a fireman, and he handles the movement of engines in and around the service area and the shops. So an inside hostler can take a locomotive out of a shop, or he knows how to start it. He can move it out of a shop building. He can move that locomotive, say, to a ready track or to a turntable, turn it around, put it back in shop for more service, and that's all the inside hostler can do. He can't take that engine out of the shop area. An outside hostler, he handles the movement of engines between passenger stations, service areas, on the main track or other locations, right? The last conductor I talked to on my trip on Amtrak was an outside hostler for a railroad down in Florida, and he had permission to move the locomotive as many as 85 miles to go to another station. So he can go out, as it says, on the main track, right? He's got a lot more experience with operating the locomotive. The biggest thing here is he can't pull a train. The hostler cannot pull a train. He can't have any cars of any type connected to that locomotive, but he can move the locomotive. And that's an outside hostler. Yeah, Brian.
So what if it's a power move? Gives up 2 or 3 put together?
Yeah, he can do that.
Okay.
Yeah, he can do that as long as he doesn't have a train. He can't move rolling stock. He can't move passenger cars. You can't move freight cars. You can't move a caboose. Nothing.
Can you take it out and hook it up to the train?
No, that's another job.
Okay.
All right.
Union.
And I don't have it on here, but that's called a herder.
Okay.
Okay. A herder does the connecting and disconnecting of locomotives. There's a bunch of jobs. I just didn't list them all. I didn't list statesman on here either. But a herder would take care of connecting and disconnecting locomotives. So. All right, so other jobs are yard foreman, yard master, brakeman, conductor, engineer, pilots, switchman. Do we understand what a pilot is?
Nope.
No.
Okay, so a pilot is a guy that is very familiar with the yard operation. And if you're a new guy on the roster, then the pilot is going to ride with you for a while around the yard to make sure you know where the yard tracks are, what their names are, and get familiar with the yard before you can become a operator in the yard on a switch engine or something like that. That's what a pilot does. Very similar to a pilot on that comes out on a ship.
And
When a ship comes into a harbor, the captain and the navigator and the helmsman, they might not be familiar with the harbor, so they'll send a boat out to the ship. Your pilot will get on the ship, and he will teach the guys how to get in and out of that harbor. Jeff.
If you're ever up in the UP and go east over to Detour, you'll see the ships coming from Superior to Huron, back and forth. And right there in that Detour passage, a pilot controls the movement of ships through that passage in either direction.
Oh, I'm
he
sure.
gets on and off at Detour Village.
Yeah, yeah. And they do the same thing in the yards for railroads. We're going to teach the new guy how to operate in the yard. So that's what a pilot does, a yard pilot. And then you have the switchman. Okay, so a basic yard example. I've got a couple here. They're enclosed in the red rectangles. The yard, we can see the top one's got arrival, departure tracks, storage, local track, switching lead. The bottom one, same way, yard body, yard lead. But you'll notice it has nothing to do with the main line. All right? It's all off the main. That's coming back to our definition out of the FRA. It's outside the control of the main line. Here's one that's a little more complicated. Right? This yard is Howard Yard. It's located in northwest Chicago, and it's basically a yard for I think the MTA or whatever they call it over there. So it says 282 cars is the capacity. It'll have a whole bunch of passenger cars in this yard at night waiting to go out for the next day on their commuter run. But you can see that the main line runs through the middle of this picture, and the yards are enclosed by the two red lines. So that's the yards. Again, nothing to do with the main line. Only the yard area is the yard definition. All right, yard limits. This is probably the most misunderstood thing about yards and yard limits, and how they relate to each other, because they don't relate to each other. Right? They're two distinctly different things. So we go back to the FRA, and we start to find out, okay, what is yard limits? Going back to Title 49, same thing, transportation, Chapter 2. And this time it's still within parts 200 to 299, but it's 218.35. And this is going to be more than just a definition. This is actually going to give you some rules of what a yard limit's capabilities and so forth are. So after August 1st, 1977, yard limits must be designated by, and this is all part of the rule, yard limit signs and timetable, train order, and special instructions. So we're getting to be a little more involved here of the restrictions of yard limits. There's more to this. By the way, yard limits have been around for almost forever with railroads. Right? They've been around for a long time, but not until 1977 did the FRA start putting more restrictions on or rules on identifying yard limits. Even though that some of the timetables have earlier than 77 had yard limits in it. The one I showed you from Western Pacific, that was a 1964 timetable, but you saw it had yard limits at the bottom for Salt Lake. Okay, going on, Part B of this is after 77, railroads must have an effective operating rule which complies with the requirements set forth. All right, the main tracks within yard limits, the main tracks, may be used clearing the time of approaching designated class of train due to leave the nearest station where time is shown. What they mean by that is the time on the timetable. Right? In case of failure to clear the time of designated class trains, protection must be provided, and then it goes on to other parts of the FRA for protection. In yard limits where main tracks are governed by block signal systems, protections are controlled by 21837 is not required. So depending on whether you've got a flagman that can go out there and protect, or you've got signals that can protect on the main line, that's what that is talking about. Trains and engines except designated class trains, again, that's going to be in your timetable, whether it's a class 1, 2, or 3, and how your rules are made up in your railroad you're modeling. Within yard limits must move, prepared to stop within 1/2 the range of distance, or vision rather, excuse me, by not exceeding 20 miles per hour unless the main track is known to be cleared by block signals. There's more to this that we'll cover, but I wanted to cover the 20 mile an hour thing. Again, the FRA says 20 mile an hour is restricted speed, but some railroads, like the Southern Pacific, Ron knew I was going to bring
They
this
got
book
their
up.
own rules.
They had their own rule book. Their rule said you couldn't go any faster than 12 miles an hour. All right. So if you looked in here under restricted speed, it would say 12, not 20. And other railroads did the same thing. All right. So that's yes. Bill.
So to make sure I understand, so a railroad could designate the yard limit to include the main?
Oh no, yard limits
Okay.
are only on the main.
Oh.
Yeah, there are no yard limits in a yard.
So the yard limits only apply to the main.
That's right.
That's in proximity to
Yeah, a
the
lot of
yard.
people think yard limits
I
are
see.
the turnout or switch coming off the main and into the yard. It has nothing to do with that,
I
right?
see now.
As soon as you leave that yard, you're in the main, and you could have a yard, a train leaving a yard, going onto the main, and it may not be going into yard limits, right? Unless the railroad designated that portion of the main track as a yard limit. And we'll talk more about that. Right? So, yes, Ken.
Are those designated by the railroad, but is there a federal blanket on that? In other words, everybody is no more than 20 miles an hour, but each railroad can have a safer limit?
Yes.
So they're
Yeah.
mandated by federal law not to exceed, say, 20 miles an hour, but Southern could have 15.
Yeah, just like SP did 12, right? And if you take a look at, for instance, up in the Pacific Northwest on the SP&S, they had different restrictions under 20 depending on what part of the railroad they were on, because some of the railroad was mostly in fog and bad weather along the Oregon and Washington coastline, but not so much in the eastern part of Oregon where it was desert. So their restricted speed could be 20 out on the eastern part of the state, but only maybe 15 along the coastline.
Like the Emperor of the North.
Yeah, right, the Emperor of the North. Okay. Yeah.
So individual train railroads can dictate
Yes,
below the federal.
right.
So they have the right to dictate their own policy.
Yeah, I'll use the SP as another example. You could find the rule for yard limits in this book, for instance, and it might say, it is 93, Rule 93, right? But you might find, right, Rule 93A, Rule 93B, Rule 93C, depending on which part of the railroad it is, right? Or branch line. The branch lines could have a different restricted speed as well. And we'll talk more about that.
So could I say 25 miles an hour on my railroad?
Nope, 20.
Has to be.
Yeah, 20 is the maximum.
But
But I
a
could say
railroad,
10, I could say 5,
Yeah,
but I can't say 20.
yeah. Well, a lot of branch lines had 10 because of the poor trackage.
so the railroad can supersede what the federal law is as long as it's under.
It's not superseding.
Or
It's-
under what it,
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Now, am I reading that correctly? Where there's block signaling in place that those limits don't apply, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, you got that right. It says governed by block signal system, protections prescribed is not required. All right, and that's important because you might have yard limits where first class train's coming through there. He's got a high green. He does not have to go 20 miles an hour.
Yeah, because I heard on the,
And because it's also governed by class of trains.
like on our line out here, the yards in Elkhart, the yard limit extended well past Goshen.
Mm-hmm.
So, I
And you know they're going faster than 20
Yeah.
miles an hour. Yeah, right.
unless you're happen to be waiting on it.
Right, yeah. Now, of course, it's up, and we'll talk a little bit more about access to the yard limits. All right. So within yard limits, movement against the current of traffic on the main track must not be made unless authorized, this is where we get into this, authorized and protected by train order, yard master, other designated official, and only under the operating restrictions of, again, 218.35, that's your restrictions. Each railroad shall designate in the operating rule prescribed under paragraph B back there of this section, the class of trains which shall have superiority on the main track within yard limits. All right. So if you got a class of train that does not have to go 20 miles an hour or less, right? He can go faster. And again, it has to do with signaling. So yeah, you can go faster in yard limits than 20. So,
Would the exception be Amtrak?
but because they don't go faster. What?
No, I mean, because some places they're running 120 miles an hour. I mean, would they slow down to say 40 next to the yard and have the right of way? And they can do that, right?
When you say next to the yard, we'll talk more about
Main.
about where yard limits are at, because they're not always next to a yard. So we'll talk
Oh,
about it.
interesting.
Yeah. Remember, they have nothing to do with each other. Yards and
No.
yard limits are two separate things. Right? So yeah, this kind of answers your question, I think, Jeff. All right, so NORAC, all right, is the Northeast Operating Rules and Advisory Committee, and I don't have a copy of that. But anyway, these days, it normally applies to railroads that are on the east of Chicago area. Right? That's where NORAC rules are applied to. Rule 93, yard limits. It's basically the same thing that I just told you from the definition, or from the rule from FRA. Movement within yards, yard limits designated by timetable and indicated by yard limit signs. We'll talk about the signs. Within yard limits, movements may be made on a main track, by verbal permission of a dispatcher or operator when authorized by the dispatcher. So what does that mean? That means that, let's say you're the lonely guy out in the middle of the Midwest area, and there happens to be yard limits in your area, and you are the station operator, and somebody from your yard behind your depot wants to use the main track, he can give you permission to do that. You don't have to get a permission from a dispatcher, as long as the dispatcher has said, yeah, you can. You have control of the yard limit in your area. Right? The leading end of movement within yard limits must be operated at restricted speed. There again, 20 miles an hour. Passenger trains operating with Form D, Line 2 authority, and non-signal DCS territory may operate at normal speed. Isn't that interesting? So we don't have to do the 20 mile an hour thing, right? Trains operating in ABS territory may operate according to signal indication when the signals are more favorable than approach. So again, you can go faster than 20. Right? The way I look at the rules is they apply yes, maybe, and probably is how I look at the rules. Right?
always an exemption.
There's always some sort of way to get around them, and this is part of that. Within yard limits, movements against the current of flow must not be made without permission of dispatcher, who must first ensure that no opposing movements have been authorized. Right. That's a Form D. It talks about Form D. The line you're going to be looking at here was line 2, which is operate in direction, time between, and whatever. So you can fill that in with your dispatcher permission. So you could operate in direction both ways, east, west, north, south, so forth, and it'll give you a time limit. That means you can go out and of your yard, and operate within yard limits on the mainland or main track, and I got that ship going in, and have permission to operate there. Right? You look confused, Gary.
No.
Okay.
Just from a practical stance. So what we do here, so when they're operating the yard here, our dispatchers give whoever the yard master the permission to run the yard. That's essentially what happens here.
And that's probably not needed, because our dispatcher could care less what's going on that yard.
Right.
All right? That yard could be shuffling locomotives and rolling stock around all day long, and the dispatcher doesn't want to know. He's got too much other thing to do because he's worried about the main line and yard limits.
And that's why we do what we do.
Yeah, whatever. So yeah, we could employ yard limits on our railroad, and I do it on mine at home. And so anyway, going back to this is now the General Code of Operating Rules, which is this book. All right. I'm sorry, I don't have a copy of the NORAC rules. You'll see that yard limits is Rule 613, and it applies to mostly railroads that are west of Chicago. And it's basically the same type of information, all right? Restricted speed, watching out for movement in the opposite direction, and so forth. So all movements entering within yard limits must be made at restricted speed unless operating under a block signal or favorable approach. So you got really two different kind of two rule books out there. One for East Coast areas of railroads, one for the West Coast or western part of the railroads, and that's pretty much the way it is right now, and that's as of today. The other interesting thing about this is when you look inside one of these rule books, it will tell you which railroads are using it, which railroads are have bought into this particular code of rules. That's why railroads back in the day, like the Southern Pacific, could have their own rule book. They didn't have to use the General Code of Operating Rules. They could write their own book as long as their rules conform to the FRA and the Code of Federal Regulations. That's all that was required. Okay, permission for reverse movements. The rest of 641. This is one of the big things about yard limits. Upon observing or having advanced knowledge that a block signal may require restricted speed due to yard limits, if entering or within the yard limits, the movement must be restricted at restricted speed at the block signal or as soon as possible thereafter, consistent with good train handling. In other words, you're not going to apply emergency brakes, but you're going to try to have proper train handling. In the older days, you weren't going to throw the guys around the caboose all over the place. Right? You didn't want to spill their coffee. Obtain permission from the train dispatcher or control operator. Again, a control operator could be a station master. He could be a yard master. Doesn't necessarily have to be a dispatcher. Before making a reverse move, unless the movement is within the same block of any of the following territories: CTC and signal train warrant control or traffic warrant control. Those are a little different because they are mostly controlled by a dispatcher. The traffic, or is it traffic warrant control?
Track warrant.
Track warrant control.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Gary. And CTC. So a dispatcher has jurisdiction over those two type of signaling systems, but other than that, a yard master or a station operator or whatever can authorize movement in the yard limits coming out of a yard. Oops, did I go too far? So purpose of yard limits, again, is an extension of yard switching in both automatic and block or manual systems. So let's say you got your yard all backed up and you do have yard limit capability. Right? You could ask permission to go out on the yard or out on the main line and run around your train, for instance, or get at the other end of the yard if it's got two entrances, and come back into the yard and operate your yard by using the main. But you do it through yard limits on the main. It gives an area where moves can be made without train orders Form Ds, etc. We talked about the Form D. By permission of an operator or dispatcher. The operator again could be a yard master or a station master or something like that. Usually used in areas near yards, or where frequent reverse moves are made. And this is the important part of this, is it doesn't have to be, yard limits don't have to be near a yard. And I'll give you an example of that. Yard limits have nothing to do with a yard or switching limits. Switching limits is a different subject altogether. I didn't cover it in this presentation. But if you want to know what switching limits is, I'll be happy to tell you. CTC territory, where yard limits are in effect of CTC, the control operator must authorize reverse movement on the main track. Again, that is usually, or 99.99%, a dispatcher, not a yard master or a station operator.
So really, a yard limit then is a special section of the main line that the dispatcher needs to know something potentially could be going on in there.
Absolutely, that, and plus, not only is it a special section, but your rule books will tell your train engineers and your conductors that they're in the yard limits. They have certain restrictions as well. Mm-hmm. Again, they're not going into a yard. Yeah. Yard limits have nothing to do with actual yard switches, and it's usually areas requiring frequent reverse moves. So what happens is you take a railroad that has a branch line where it may have quite a few number of places to switch along the branch line. The branch line could be 30 miles long. They could designate that entire branch line as yard limits, all right? And there might not be one single yard along that 30 miles. But they'll give the branch line, main line, the branch main line, yard limit access. So that train can move forward, reverse, switch industries, and continue on down the branch. It could maybe go halfway down the branch and then turn around and come back the other way, right? And so the entire branch line has yard limits access. Jeff?
A good example around here might be from Main Street in Elkhart east on the Grand Elk. There are a bunch of businesses out there and they're switching stuff all the time, and it's a one-track main line.
Yep, that's a good example. And the other thing about it is yard limits are not they're not placed in stone or concrete. They in a sense that they can the railroad can change yard limits. Say they had an industry along the line that they were switching, and so they said, okay, we're going to designate a mile on both sides of that industry as yard limits, but then that industry closed down, then they can remove the yard limits off the main. Right? They don't need it there anymore. And the converse to that is they might have to create yard limits on a main line. The CN had to do that when they bought EJ&E. Is that what it was, EJ&E? They applied to the FRA so they could create yard limits in a certain area along the EJ&E, and it took them a couple months. They had to do pages and pages of study and show safety things, and they had to, it ended up, they changed some of the yard tracks, they changed some of the main tracks, and all that. So,
maybe the confusion is when you think yard limits, you're thinking of a line that says this is the end of the yard, but maybe what it really is yard rules. That'd be another word for it.
Yeah, I personally, I would think they'd call it restricted limits instead of yard limits, but because it is confusing. Yeah. But it has nothing to do with
These
the
are
other
rules.
Jeff.
Now, I had somebody tell me that, say a road train makes it to inside the yard limits, but the crew times out. One of the aspects of having the yard limit is that the yard can send a yard crew out to bring that train in instead of wasting another road crew.
Or having to sit on the main and tie up the main.
Yeah, so is that?
Yeah, I suppose that is feasible. Two Amtrak trips I had to make a while back. The crew ran out of time. We sat on the main for about 5 hours waiting for a new crew to show up. Yeah. So So it could still tie up at Maine. Now, of course, it was double track, so were routing other trains and freights around us, but we never left the Maine. Yard limits. Examples. This will be quick. Main track, right? The next example again is going to be the yard in Chicago. But let's say you had a station on the outer main on the west side, okay, and you needed to move a locomotive. Your outside hostler wants to move a locomotive from the yard over to the station, right? So you might create yard limits to allow him to do that. That's an example of using yard limits. So on that large yard we looked at earlier, the red line area is the main. Again, you're going to want to move stuff from the yard to the main and so forth, or from the south yard to the north yard. So you're going to move across the main, right? So that area might be designated as yard limits to allow that to happen. Gary?
You don't do yard limits on the fly. That's got to be all sanctioned and everything. You can't just have the dispatcher make an extension of your yard limits or something. That has to all be done for rule books and such.
Yeah, that's why when CN wanted to create yard limits on a portion of the EJ&E, they had to apply to the FRA to create yard limits in that portion of the area. And then everybody in the world has to know, the dispatchers on down, that there's now a new area for yard limits. And then your timetable would change, your employee timetable would change to show where the new yard limits are at. Right? So good introduction, okay? How do we identify yard limits? Right? The biggest place, remember the FRA said it had to be in timetables, employee timetables, and signage, right? And markers, right? So we I use this one as the example because this is from what I use from my railroad. This is the employee timetable for Western Pacific Eastern Division, and I model between Wendover and Salt Lake, so that's a portion of that is in this timetable. So that's what I use for my milepost markers on my railroad, and my yard limit signs. Right. So, did we cover everything on that? I think we did. Placed along markers along the track and so forth. We'll take a look at those in a minute. All right, let's look inside the timetable. And besides the earlier picture I showed you of the timetable where it had the station listing, and it had towards at the bottom it said yard limits. I think that was near Salt Lake and Roper Yard. Also inside the timetable will tell you specifically where those yard limits are at. So I broke out that portion of the timetable over here. It has the milepost markers for the branch line, and we talked about branch lines maybe being yard limits from one end to the other. In this case, that branch line is 32 miles long from Reno to the end of the branch, and I know, Gary, it's hard to read, 32.43 miles to the end of branch. So that's the east east end of the yard limit and the west end of the yard limit. In my area, Salt Lake and Roper, it starts at 926, I think is what that says. I don't know whether I can make it any clearer. To the end of the end of main line, which is the end of yard limits for Salt Lake area. So that's two places where you can find the yard limits in your timetable. One is in the very beginning where the listing of stations are at, and in more specifically deeper in the timetable, I think this is page 26 or whatever it is, and it tells you what the milepost markers are for the yard limits. Warning and yard limit signs. The warning sign would say yard limit 1 mile or 1 mile to yard limit. The one on the upper left is probably not used anymore. The one in this one, the rectangle one that says 1 mile to yard limit, those are still in use. Okay? The one on the bottom where it indicates yard limits, these will be signs along the main line. The oval one is a very old one. The one in the middle had the little reflector bulbs or whatever, or the glass reflectors in them. That was probably 40s, 50s. The more common one today is the Y-shaped yard limit sign, and you'll find those along the main line where yard limits exist. Any question about signage or timetables? All right, the bibliography, I won't go through the whole thing, but this will tell you where I got all the information for my presentation for yards and yard limits. Obviously, the Code of Federal Regulations is where we started. Rail Yards is a really neat website. If you're modeling a particular area and you want to know if that railroad had a yard and where it was located, you go to a list of rail yards on Wikipedia, and it has a huge list of rail yards, not only in the United States but other countries as well. So, and this will be online. Timetables, rule books, guides, so forth. Modeling resources down at the bottom. Hobby supplies. Rights of Trains, I mentioned that book. It's still in print, and Condensed Code of Operating Rules for Model Railroads. That book is still in print as well. Thanks for watching our presentation on yards and yard limits, and I hope that you can apply what you've learned here tonight for your model railroad.